morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. It's Wednesday, January 19th, 2022, and today I'm talking about precedent, but I'm not for once not talking about the Supreme Court, the court system at all, or the doctrine of stare decisis. On this episode, I want to share with you a different way that the founding generation, the old revolutionaries, use the term precedent. Basically, anytime government does stuff it's not supposed to do, and when you live under the largest government in history, it's all the time. It's literally every second of every single day. But not just when they try to do it, but when they get away with it. It's a precedent for them to do more. It's really a reworking of the old adage of power corrupts, power expands, and power always grows. So I've got a bunch of wisdom and warnings, first and last, from the penman of the American Revolution, John Dickinson, but also Washington, Jefferson, Adams, Madison, Mason, and a few examples of how things have played out based on what they warned against today. But first of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Our show homepage is everything you need to follow us, all the archives for 3.5 years. On individual episodes, I publish a blog post for each episode on that show homepage about 1 to 2 hours after the live broadcast is done. And there you're going to find links to stuff that I talk about in the episode because I'm just scratching the surface. And that way you can read and learn more in context on your own time. You can find all the different platforms we're on. Of course, we live stream on the mainstream ones like YouTube and Facebook and Twitch and Twitter, but we also live stream at the decentralized, censorship-resistant Odyssey.com, ODYSEE.com. It is my favorite social platform of any type right now, definitely my favorite video platform because they're moving towards a decentralized. The problem that I see with most of these platforms is they have centralized control, and that is an easy attack vector for centralized government to pressure them to do what they want. Anyways, we also have all the audio podcast editions, the platforms there, and even our membership program where you can put your financial faith behind our work for as little as $2 a month, and we couldn't be more grateful for any consideration you can give to joining us today. Again, the show homepage, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. I want to say a quick hello and give people, say hello to everyone out in the live chat and give people another minute or two to get notifications so they can join us in the live stream. There's Tim Martin in Arizona, Dixie Strong in Bama, Justin Morrison, Clay Kent, Dan Reed from the People's Republic of Oregonia. That's awesome. Good to see you, buddy. Dave Simmons. You should check out Dan Reed's website and podcast, Culinary Libertarian. He's a great friend of the TAC, and I consider him a friend of mine as well. Marcus, good to see you as well. Laura, Justin and Eitlander, Angel Eyes Over Texas, Punish 1871, Joe, Jackie, Joshua, Erwin, Haverneck in Omaha, and everyone else. Thank you so much for being here. I will check out the comments a little bit later in the episode or later today and see if I can answer some questions or reply to your thoughts. And I also get tons of great ideas for future episodes. So please continue leaving your feedback there in the comments. I might start adding some polls or some other interactive things for the live shows. Let me know if that's something of interest to you as well. Anyways, let's start out with John Dickinson, the penman of the Revolution. And this is one that I've been citing quite a bit lately, talking about how it's up to the people to keep their own government under their own constitution in check, not to rely on government itself. And this is John Dickinson in 1765, I believe in November of 1765, a broadside that he published urging resistance and noncompliance with the Stamp Act. And here's how he put it. If you comply with the act using stamped papers, you fix, you rivet perpetual chains upon your unhappy country. You unnecessarily, voluntarily establish the detestable precedent. It's the detestable precedent. Not only is it just a precedent for more power, some people are arguing, oh, it's not too bad, so let's not risk our necks about this. We hear this all the time today. But Dickinson is making the case that even if you don't think this is a terrible exercise of power, something to risk your freedom over, to make a strong stand about, to even just oppose with nonviolent, noncompliant resistance, he's saying you're establishing the detestable precedent, not just a bad one, but absolutely detestable. He said, you then voluntarily establish the detestable precedent which those who have forged your fetters ardently wish for, to varnish the future exercise of this new claimed authority. And we can use, or Dickinson is using varnish in that way of cover or conceal. So they want, he's saying that the people who really want your total submission, they want you completely on your knees. In 1765, they're going to start out with maybe not the biggest step against it, maybe a moderate, maybe to some people it's huge, but to some people it's small, and they want to conceal their end goal, which is total and complete control. And even when he was right, because even when they got rid of the Stamp Act due to the people's nullification of it, the resistance, the opposition to it, they then passed an act that claimed the power over the colonies in all cases whatsoever. So no matter what, they had supreme unlimited power. And Dickinson and Jefferson in 1775, July 6, 1775, in the Declaration as to why, the causes of why they were taking up arms, of course, after April 19 of that year, they talked about how, why should we list all the problems, all the specifics of what you're doing if you're claiming the power over us in all cases whatsoever. So he warned that they were starting with one thing and they were going to expand it to much more. He was absolutely correct. He goes on, he says, you may judge of the use that will be made of it by... I got to try that again. You may judge of the use that will be made of it by the eagerness with which the pack of ministerial tools, I like how he said they're just tools of the ministry, officials in the king's cabinet, he said, for example, have hunted for precedents to palliate the horrors of this attack upon the American freedom. And I had to look this up, and I tweeted about it yesterday. If you're not following me, at Michael Bolden, all spelled out Boldin. I had to look it up yesterday. I didn't know what this word, and I've read this so many times, and I was just trying to understand it from context. But palliate was used to disguise the gravity of this attack upon American freedom. Now, Dickinson warned about this in 1765. He wasn't the first to warn about this type of thing. He understood the nature of power. And in fact, all the old revolutionaries understood the nature of power. Power would always seek to expand. And we've seen this play out in many, many, many ways in more modern times as well. For example, the income tax. I mean, one of the worst things ever. And we have the Revenue Act of 1913, which was passed just months after the 16th Amendment. And here from the nice, pretty straightforward wiki page on it, they say the Revenue Act of 1913 imposed a 1% tax on incomes above $3,000. 1% on incomes above $3,000. I don't know what that is adjusted for inflation. Maybe someone can tell me in the chat. But my understanding is that this was really intended to be a very small tax on just the richest of the rich. Those people aren't paying their fair share, right? And they were pushing for this, the progressives, the socialists of the time. In fact, the socialists in the late 19th century were certainly pushing for a progressive income tax to tax the rich. And it's the same kind of thing that we hear today. But if you're saying, oh, it's just going to be a percent on this amount or more, and then what is it today? So it was 1% on $3,000 above, with a top tax rate of 6% on those earning more than $500,000 per year. $500,000, $500,000 per year in 1913. I mean, I would be very happy with a $500,000 a year. I've never been close to that. I'm an activist for liberty. This is not a way to get rich, I'll tell you that. Approximately 3% of the population are those measures. And this is why it looks to me that it was really just intended to be, it probably was intended to be against everybody. But just like Dickinson warned, they want to cover, they want to varnish, or they want to palliate, disguise the gravity of this type of attack on American freedom, on liberty in general. And it was only going to be on 3%. They said approximately 3% of the population was subject to the income tax in 1913. 3%. And they have a nice table here. So the rates, they had a normal rate, an additional rate, and a combined rate. So up to 20K was total of 2%, 100K was 5%, 500,000 total of 7%. So that is something that we can see that they started out with something small, was going to protect people, was going to deal with problems from tariffs and maybe war and things like that. And what has it turned into today? But it's turned into turning every person with an employee into an agent of the state, working for the government to collect the taxes on behalf of the government. Another one, of course, is the Patriot Act. Remember that one? How that was only going to be used for the terrorists? I mean, it's absurd. I did an episode on this a couple of years ago, November of 2019, Patriot Act on steroids. A lot of people only think that the Patriot Act was about Section 215, the call detail records, the CDR program, just tracking phone calls. And, oh, well, not too many people are making day-to-day phone calls like they used to, and there's other ways to do the technology. But the surveillance state that was established by the Patriot Act and its successor created so much more. And I mentioned things in the overview of that episode. We got things like fusion centers, information sharing, national security letters, TSA enhanced screening, the growth of facial recognition. We have the Real ID Act. And remember the Real ID Act? That was also supposed to stop the terrorists. It was going to be a national, it's still on the books. It was signed into law, I think, in 2005. It was supposed to go into effect in 2008. It's never been fully implemented. It's partly implemented. I don't have a Real ID compliant driver's license even here in California. Still to this day, at some point, I'm sure they're going to try to corner me and to the point where I have this thing. But that was going to be used to stop the terrorists because of supposedly we were scared that all these people got into the country with all these different types of IDs, blah, blah, blah. And then a lot of people who support strong restrictions on immigration have always been in favor of this type of a nationalized standard for driver's license, even though there's no such thing authorized as the federal government in the Constitution. And let's say it was just that, and some people are happy with that. They never, ever, ever take a power that's been given to them and just use it as is and don't try to expand it in the future. Here's an example that hasn't happened yet, but a friend of mine, Robert Scott Bell, who does a 6-day-a-week show as well, primarily on health freedom, that I think you guys will probably find very interesting, sometimes very provocative, but he's a really good guy and a great friend of mine personally. He's been warning that they were going to use this Real ID card and just add onto it your jab status. Do you have certain health situations? Have you followed the health orders of the government? And we're going to put that on your ID card. And when you go places like get on an airplane, they're going to require that. And I've got here up on SSRN a law review paper that's actually making the case for that early last year. It's nowhere close to happening today. Well, When Robert used to talk about this on his show, I'd be like, well, yeah, that could happen. But even I poo-pooed that idea. A person who's always warning about how things might be used badly in the future, because I wasn't thinking long-term enough. I was thinking too short-term, and I wasn't thinking how they might have problem reaction solution. Of course, a situation where the population is in fear. They're totally scared. They want more crackdowns. They are going to beg for this kind of thing. And many people are. We know that a lot of people want to throw people in jail if they don't follow their particular choices when it comes to their personal health. Anyways, here Leslie G points out that commercial driver's license must be Real ID compliant, and that's an expansion of federal power under the Commerce Clause as well, and this is one of the ways that they're pushing this type of thing forward. So I think these are examples of people wanting more power in government without thinking about the long-term impact. Every time you give government power today, you have to think, how will my enemies use this power in the future? If you only think the people in power are going to be exactly like you and do exactly the way you want, you're not only doing yourself a disservice, but everyone in your family for all time. And you should never, ever do that. And this is exactly what George Washington warned about in his famous farewell address in September 19th of 1796. It was originally drafted by James Madison with some reworking. Madison in 1792 because Washington was going to step down. And then Hamilton did some reworking. It was definitely under the direction of Washington. And here's how he put it. He's basically saying, if you don't like the restrictions on government, there's a process to change it to give it more power. But let there be no change by usurpation. Don't ever let them do anything that isn't authorized. And maybe he's speaking from personal experience or his own actions. I'm not sure. Or maybe he thought all of his actions were okay. But he certainly exercised powers and signed stuff into law that was not authorized by the Constitution as well. And he was really, in comparison to today, one of the smallest government people in history compared to all these people today. And he was signing terrible things like establishing the first bank and the whiskey tax and things like that. So he says, let there be no change by usurpation. This is an example, of course, quick aside. Every time I talk about people like Washington, even Jefferson, Adams, all of them, when they get in power, that's a great example. When they do stuff they're not supposed to do, this is the greatest warning. Even if you get someone who's always right in principle and what they write about or very close to it, once they're in a place to abuse that power, you can't trust them. Anyways, let there be no change by usurpation. I'm going to say this over and over and over. Don't let government do stuff they're not authorized to do. For though this, in one instance, may be the instrument of good, it is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. So that gets back to the people who made the case or who were okay with things like a tiny income tax, progressive on the richest of the rich. Just 3% of the population are going to be subject to this. No worries. This will get us through this difficult time and everything will be cool and it'll never be worse than that. I'm not sure if that was the argument, but certainly it was sold to the public and passed that it was really only going to be very, very, very limited, and it's nowhere close to that today. The IRS has its tentacles in literally everything we do. The banking system, all kinds of stuff, and the Patriot Act makes it even worse. George Washington goes even further. He says, again, we're getting back to that term, the precedent must always greatly overbalance in permanent evil any partial or transient benefit which the use can at any time yield. So even if you like the short-term outcome, if you like the idea of a real ID card because you don't want a bunch of illegal immigration, that's not the way to stop it. That's not the approach, is by giving them more power than they should have, because they're going to use, or even, if you think about it, even if they should have the power, don't be surprised when someone else has it and in the future and does stuff that you don't want. Just like the people who are advocating adding health. Like, think about it. You have to swipe your papers, please. Oh, well, you don't have the proper health inoculations, so you can't go here. You can't travel. You can't visit your family. There's no, in fact, in that argument, they wanted to add MMR. I never even got MMR as a kid. I don't think my parents were on board with that kind of thing, and I was born early enough in the early 70s, throwing out my age there. I was born early enough where this wasn't really fully implemented yet. So I missed the cutoff for MMR. But they want to add, this guy is calling for adding MMR. And he's saying there should be no religious exemptions for travel. So if you want to get on an airplane, you got this national ID card, you can't even have a religious exemption. It doesn't matter what your views are, you have to comply, or too bad, you're not part of day-to-day society. And that's what George Washington is talking about here. Even if you like it, and I know no one here likes that kind of stuff, but there are people out there, there's millions of people who like this stuff, and they're not thinking, how is someone going to use that power in the future? No one thinks like that. They only think what they want right now, and it changes based on which team is in power. It is factions and party politics and partisan hackery to the max. This is, again, the short version is really, if you give them a little additional power today, they're always going to use it in a bad way in the future. And it's another version of that old adage, like I was saying before, that power corrupts. Power always seeks to expand. And here's George Mason in the Philadelphia Convention, June 11th, 1787. He said, those who have power in their hands will not give it up while they can retain it. Never. They just don't. They don't voluntarily say, well, all this power you gave me, I shouldn't have this. No. That's not how it works. They either will just leave it on the books, they'll ignore it, or they'll try to exercise that power in ways that fits their political narrative. And that's how it always goes. Those who have power in their hands will not give it up while they can retain it. On the contrary, we know they will always, when they can, rather increase it. Always when they can. So if they can logistically make it happen, if they can politically make it happen, they will always do it. And we know, if we're just talking about, if we zoom out and we look at the broad picture of the size and scope of the so-called former federal government, now national centralized empire in Washington, D.C., it doesn't matter who's been in charge in Washington, D.C., who's been the president, it doesn't matter which team has had the White House. In the long run, power has always expanded. The size and scope of government has always gotten bigger. So George Mason, surprise, surprise, was right about the nature of power. Now, this doesn't always just happen in one fell swoop. It rarely happens overnight. And James Otis warned about this all the way back in 1767, writing as Freeborn American. He said a free government, that might be an oxymoron, but anyways, a free government never degenerated into tyranny all at once. It is the work of years. There is nothing, however, will in the end more surely work the destruction of liberty than a prevailing opinion that it is better tamely to submit than nobly assert and vindicate our privileges. But the important point for this episode, and I've used that quote many times on this show, is that a situation of freedom, let's just call it that, because I have a hard time saying free government, even though James Otis was much smarter than me. A society of freedom never degenerates into tyranny all at once. It just doesn't happen. It takes time. Here's how James Madison put it some years later. Where did he do this one? Madison, this was in the Virginia Ratifying Convention in a debate with Patrick Henry. There were pretty epic debates between these two. I think they were both right about a lot of things, and I think they both erred on some things as well, but I should cover Patrick Henry's speeches and Madison's responses at some point on this show. But here's how Madison put it. He said, there are more instances of the abridgment of freedom of the people by gradual and silent encroachments by those in power than by violent and sudden usurpations. They get something on the books, and just like John Dickinson warned, they want to varnish it, they want to cover it up, they want to conceal, they want to palliate it, they want to really just kind of hide the amount of power that they're really grasping for in the long run. So if you always approach every new policy, every new approach, every new regulation, every new act, every new proposal, every new executive order with, well, this is what they're telling me today, how will someone use this in 5 years or 50 years or 500 years? Then you really care about liberty, you care about the Constitution, you care about your future, you care about your offspring, you care about generations to come. And James Madison certainly warned about this. Now, sometimes it seems like it comes out of nowhere, and I think a lot of times that's because it has been silent and gradual encroachments. It has been covered up by those in power. But also, we live in an age of information, and people are very much, they're lazy about it. They're happy to get whatever. Well, we're all victims of government propaganda, so I shouldn't be too hard on people, although I was a victim of government propaganda. I mean, I was a self-proclaimed Marxist. I was a bad one. I don't think I really understood the theories well, but I thought it was cool to say that I was a Marxist. I grew up in a place where we had a socialist mayor in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I'm pretty confident that the guy had an S next to his name from most of my childhood. And so I believe that every problem required a government solution. I thought that government should take over industries. I mean, they certainly have in many ways through regulation, even if they haven't owned it. But I would make the case for things like, well, it just seemed logical to me during I think it was airline bailouts in the 80s sometime. I was a kid, and I'm like, if government's going to pay money for these airlines, that should be considered an investment, and they should just own the airlines. This seemed normal to me. So a lot of us are we're victims of propaganda. We're not paying attention. Of course, it's natural for us to just want to live our lives, earn an income, spend time with friends, family, and the like, have holidays. We've got a lot of work to do on a day-to-day lives. The Federal Reserve is making it harder and harder to earn a good, we'll say, living wage because they're destroying our purchasing power. So we don't have as much time and energy to deal with this stuff. But over time, eventually, even if it's silent and gradual encroachments, it does speed up over time. And John Adams warned about this in his Novanglus letters. This one, the third one, in February of 1775, he put it this way: the nature of encroachment upon the American Constitution is such as to grow every day more and more encroaching. Like a cancer, it eats faster and faster every hour. Like a cancer. So every single time they take a step beyond the Constitution, this is a cancer. And this wasn't about the written Constitution at the time. That was the unwritten Constitution that John Adams was talking about. But it's the same message. Thomas Jefferson had the exact same message as John Adams, his sometimes opponent, sometimes friend, sometimes frenemy over the years. But at the end of the day, a single step is a step too far. Just like George Washington told us, even if you like the short-term results, this is a weapon. Getting people what they want in the short term by exercising power not delegated to them is a weapon. They're doing that as a weapon to expand power and hand that power to future generations to do worse stuff. Jefferson understood this as well in his 1791 argument or opinion against the constitutionality of the National Bank, which unfortunately George Washington signed into law. This was a Hamiltonian thing, and I can't get that. I just don't get it. Anyways, here's how Jefferson put it. To take a single step, and if you're watching on the video, this is a black background, white text, and we put it in yellow for the yellow and black there. But we're highlighting a single step because that single step is the important precedent. As soon as you establish that detestable precedent, they're going to do far more. And that's how Jefferson put it. To take a single step beyond the powers thus specially drawn around the powers of Congress is to take possession of a boundless field of power, no longer susceptible of any definition. It's not, Jefferson was saying, it's not saying that, oh, they're having a boundless field of power right now, but you're establishing the precedent that they can expand that. And because we know that power will always seek to expand itself, it's always going to attract the worst of the worst to try to use that power, to wield that power, to expand that power, to enrich themselves. We know for sure that it is a boundless field of power as soon as you establish the precedent that they can go beyond the limits. And just to close it out here, this is kind of a long passage that I've cited a few times, but here's John Dickinson again in letter number 9 from his Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania in 1767 against the hated Townshend Acts. This is the series of letters that garnered him the name, the penman of the American Revolution. These documents were the most widely read on American liberty up until the publication of Thomas Paine's Common Sense in January 1776. And here he is closing out paper number 9. And I know those of you who regularly listen to the show know this passage. He says, one most memorable example in history is so applicable to the point now insisted on that it will form a just conclusion of the observations that have been made. Spain, he wrote, was once free. Their Cortes resembled our parliaments. No money could be raised on the subject without their consent. So the idea that there could be no money raised for the government without approval of the parliament. But one of the kings, having received a grant to them to maintain a war against the Moors, desired that if the sum which they had given should not be sufficient, he might be allowed, for that emergency only, to raise more money without assembling the Cortes. So the rule was they couldn't raise money without the representatives of the people saying it was okay. They were in a war. And of course, as James Madison warned us over and over years later, but certainly he said war is the most to be dreaded danger to public liberty, because from war you get armies, and from armies you get debts and taxes. And according to Madison, armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments for putting the many under the domination of the few. And it's always an emergency. It's always based on fear. We have people always afraid of dying. They're afraid of defending themselves. And here in this emergency only in Spain, the Cortes agreed for that emergency only, John Dickinson told us, to allow the king to raise money without assembling the parliament. He said, the request was violently opposed by the best and wisest men in the assembly. It was, however, complied with by the votes of a majority. So that was the end of it. He said, and this single concession was a precedent. He used all caps. He's not a boomer. He used all caps. He said, this single concession was a precedent for other concessions of the like kind. He was really hammering home. This is a very good use of all caps. Single step was what Thomas Jefferson said in 1791. A single step beyond the Constitution is the precedent to establish an unlimited field of power. And Dickinson said the same thing. The single concession was a precedent for other concessions of the like kind, until at last the Crown obtained a general power of raising money in cases of necessity, not just against this one war and this one emergency, not just an income tax on 3 people of 1% or 5%, but on everybody all the time, and every business being corralled into being agents of that unconstitutional agency. I'll just call it that. So it eventually got this general power of raising money in cases of necessity. The king said, well, this is needed, so we got it. He says, from that period, the Cortes ceased to be useful and the people ceased to be free. And he closed it out with oppose a disease at its beginning. Oppose a disease at its beginning. The precedent is the detestable problem that we face. We certainly have faced it for a long, long time. And basically everything that we live under today has some precedent from before that people turned a blind eye to. The founders were absolutely right. Now that means it's going to be very difficult to turn things around. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. I hope it encourages you to read and learn more. Of course, if you support the show, we could really use your financial help over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Any consideration you can give to pitching in $2 a month, or there are other options as well, would be most appreciated. Of course, you can leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform. Smash the like button, things like that. That helps us spread the word as well. Let me take a look over in the chat and see if there's any things that I can get to here. Clay Kent, government regulations. This is exactly how young people think. I mean, I'm not a young people anymore myself in comparison to people who are older than them, but I certainly, again, we're victims of government propaganda. We're put in these government-run schools, and we're taught that all problems come with a government solution, that the Constitution, there's no reason to study any of that. You just study dates. History is about studying dates and battles and war and things like who's a general and who won this and what date was this signed and how many senators and what age. They never talk about the reasons for limiting power. Clay Kent is absolutely right. Tyranny is gained inch by inch. And that's why Thomas Jefferson understood in his letter to the Reverend Charles Clay in 1790, he said, the ground of liberty is to be gained by inches. We have to be contented to secure what we can get from time to time, but eternally press forward for what is yet to get, because it takes time to convince even people what is for their own good. That's Justin and Knightlander says, what does a man have to identify as to retain his rights around here? That's pretty funny. Tax on the unvaxxed. Good morning from Missouri. Anyways, I'm going to scroll through this. There's a lot of back and forth here. People recommending homeschool. Gun I asked about, do you know about the attack on our Second Amendment Protection Act or Second Amendment Preservation Act in Missouri? Absolutely. There's a lawsuit. I'm thinking of doing an episode. I think it's about time. I just got to start talking about the thin blue line, because every time we try to advance something that rejects gun control, federal, state, whatever, the number one opposition is not the Moms Demand, the Bloomberg people. It's law enforcement groups. And we really need to address that problem, because there is a blind adherence to these are the good guys. And if they're the ones working against our right to keep and bear arms or various other issues, we really, really have to start addressing that and not seeing them as always being our allies. I'm glad you mentioned that. I might do an episode on that on Friday. Justin Knight says, thank you. Great show. I appreciate that so much as well. Leslie, I'm so glad I've chosen to use my degree in education to homeschool my own children. I mean, that's got to be, I don't have kids, so I homeschool my 2 parents, and that's hard enough. I can't imagine the dedication it takes. But if you really believe in liberty, you believe in the Constitution, you want your children to not be not just propagandized by the state-run education, the federally funded state-run education in many situations, centralized control, one-size-fits-all solutions, telling a history that government is always there to protect and save us, which is just garbage because we live under the largest empire in history. But if you really, really care about the future of your children, I can understand why people would want to put that kind of effort, not just against the propaganda, but the peer pressure of all the people around them who don't have parents who are teaching their kids about liberty to actually offset the garbage that they're learning. That is a very difficult situation. I know it was for me as well. I was part of the propaganda team. And I'd like to think I'm at least one of the good guys, but we'll see. Gunai also says, look at Senate Bill 1033. Absolutely. Okay, anyways, I will look more in the chat a little bit later today. Again, please do make any consideration you can give to joining us as a member, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members, reviews on Apple Podcasts, smashing like buttons on the video platforms, leaving comments, sharing links. All that stuff will trigger algorithms. Well, the membership will help us roll up our sleeves every day and take a stand for the Constitution and liberty. Anyways, thank you so much for being here. I hope you enjoyed the show today. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you next time here on the path to liberty.